So it is Sunday. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you were saying with the mask. So this woman walked by and said something as I was just starting to film a little bit of video, but I didn't hear what she said. So in any case, it is Sunday the 19th of December 2021, and I'm just starting up my protest against Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy. That, amongst other things, includes a fair bit of clergy sexual misconduct, but it's not just the clergy sexual misconduct itself that's the problem. It's the cover-up and the denial of clergy sexual misconduct, indeed egregious clergy sexual abuse that includes pedophilia and rape, being covered up and denied by the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA Board of Trustees, a good number of Unitarian Universalist ministers, and a whole lot of Unitarian Universalist lay people. So in one way or another, a good number of Unitarian Universalists, and certainly the institutions, as I said, the Unitarian Universalist Association is an institution, the Unitarian Church of Montreal is an institution, and various other institutional level segments of Unitarian Universalism do in fact try to cover up and even officially deny the clergy sexual misconduct problem that Unitarian Universalism has, not to mention the non-sexual clergy misconduct problem that Unitarian Universalism has. But obviously most people would consider the sexual misconduct problem to be more serious than the non-sexual misconduct. But that's not always the case, because it would be fair to say that some of the lower levels of clergy sexual misconduct are actually not as bad as some of the worst forms of non-sexual clergy misconduct. So there's what could be described as a spectrum, and on that spectrum there is non-clergy sexual abuse or non-sexual clergy misconduct that is actually worse than some of the less serious forms of clergy sexual misconduct. That's not something that I think has ever really been addressed by the Unitarian Universalist religious community. They're too busy covering up and denying everything as much as they think they can get away with. Now they've been forced into a certain amount of disclosure, but the fact of the matter is that they haven't properly and fully disclosed the full extent and seriousness of sexual misconduct committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. I don't think they've ever addressed sexual misconduct committed by Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers. That's an issue that they haven't really touched upon very much. They have spoken about clergy sexual misconduct and clergy sexual abuse because they've basically been forced into it. They have no choice because the information's out there and they have to address it. And in fact, I like to think that I am part of the reason why they have to address it, because they have tried to silence me quite a few times. They have tried to intimidate me into taking down blog posts that speak about such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalists such as Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and Reverend Victoria Weinstein's First Parish Norwell parishioner Richard Buell. In June of 2012, as I mentioned in the previous clip, I was served with a cease and desist demand letter, which was falsely accusing me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for blogging about what the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney described as such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And that was clearly an attempt to conceal from the public the fact that Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and Richard Buell, to say nothing of other Unitarian Universalists, were in fact charged, tried, and convicted and sentenced to jail terms for raping children is what it comes down to. And the UUA was trying to conceal this by trying to intimidate me into taking down blog posts that kept it in the public eye, because there wasn't a lot of information, even though the Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell case had been covered in mainstream media, mostly local Massachusetts media. I think there was a brief thing about it in the Boston Globe at some point, but it was mostly reported in local newspapers in Massachusetts. But you know, some of these reports were on the internet, and it's funny though, because at a certain point, you know, some of the information that had previously been there disappeared, and this is certainly true of Richard Buell. In the case of Richard Buell, there was a few reports by the Norwell Mariner newspaper on the internet that spoke about how he was charged, tried, and convicted of raping preteen children, making him a pedophile rapist, and that one of these preteen children was a female family member who, in terms of the age difference, was almost certainly a granddaughter. So these were available on the internet for a number of years, but they're gone. Like it's very hard to find anything about Richard Buell other than what I've put up there. And it was sort of in a similar situation for a while with Mac Mitchell, particularly in terms of sort of main, easily accessible web pages. There just wasn't a lot about Mac Mitchell out there, and even when there was, he wasn't necessarily identified specifically as a Unitarian Universalist minister. In other words, some of the reports spoke about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, but they didn't mention which, you know, religious community he belonged to. So that's it. You know, they tried to intimidate me into taking down these blog posts. This again is in 2012. Yeah, just coming up for a decade ago, which is something else to talk about, because when the Unitarian Universalist Association hired Stikeman Elliott barristers and bullshitters, defamation lawyer, Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, to falsely accuse me of blasphemous libel for blogging about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and Richard Buell, and obviously didn't want me blogging about anyone else. I mean, the whole part of the whole thing with the cease and desist demand letter is they're not only demanding that you take down what you've already published and shut up. The point being is they actually do want you to shut up. They're trying to intimidate you into publishing anything else either. You know, like the whole idea is to completely silence you and get rid of whatever you may have already, you know, put on the internet and so on. So anyway, it was a completely false accusation, and I made that very, very clear very soon after the accusation was made. And I told Reverend Dr. Peter Morales, the president of the UUA, and other top-level Unitarian Universalist leaders, I told the UUA Board of Trustees that they needed to formally withdraw this false accusation. They needed to publicly apologize for it, and they needed to disclose the truth about just how many Unitarian Universalist ministers, to say nothing of Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers, are in fact guilty of committing such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, if I can use Maitre Coulombe's term. So they didn't, and here we are. It's been almost a decade. It's basically in 6 months. In 6 months, even in less than 6 months, it's going to be a full 10 years since the Unitarian Universalist Association falsely accused me of violating Canada's blasphemy law. This is a criminal act. You know, if I'd been prosecuted and found guilty, I could have potentially spent a couple of years in jail. But as I said, the accusation was completely and utterly false. There's like no way that I could have been successfully prosecuted for blasphemous libel for blogging about Unitarian Universalists, pedophiles, and rapists, unless the justice system was totally corrupt. And it's not totally corrupt. Little hint there that it might be partially corrupt. But no, it was just totally unrealistic for the Unitarian Universalist Association to threaten me with prosecution for the criminal act of blasphemous libel for telling the truth about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and Richard Buell. And I made that very, very clear. You know, the exact words of the accusation, if I remember correctly, were your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory. And then it went on to say that they're so defamatory that they constitute the criminal act of blasphemous libel. You know, that even cited the section of the Canadian Criminal Code, you know, that talks about blasphemous libel. You know, so I hadn't even heard the term blasphemous libel before. This is a new term to me. And I certainly didn't understand that it was a crime. But I looked it up, you know. One of the first things I did after receiving this email, which contained a PDF document of the actual paper letter that I was later served with by a bailiff. You know, I looked up blasphemous libel because I hadn't heard that specific term before. I knew what blasphemous meant, I knew what libel meant, but I'd never seen them together in a phrase. And as I said, I certainly wasn't aware of any criminal act known as blasphemous libel, but sure enough, there it was in the Canadian Criminal Code. And essentially it's you know, it was a crime prohibiting, essentially deeply insulting a religious community in a very egregious way, attacking, you know, what they hold to be sacred and holy and so on. So I dealt with that, and as I said, I made it very, very clear to Maitre Colombe and to UUA President, Reverend Dr. Peter Morales, and to UUA Vice President, Kathleen K. Montgomery, who would have been the person most responsible for coordinating with Maitre Colombe, the Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association, is the person who is you know, essentially most responsible for the hands-on work of coordinating the Unitarian Universalist Association's legal counsel. So this would have very much been the work of Kathleen K. Montgomery. She would have done, you know, most of the phone calls and emails and so on, you know, towards the end of having Maitre Colombe threat to prosecute me for blasphemous libel. And that's another issue in itself, which I don't mind talking about. I don't mind going off on a bit of a tangent here. Oh, I guess you want to use the... So yeah, let's talk about Kathleen K. Montgomery, because she's a key figure in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse cover-up and denial. Not to mention the negligent and complicit mishandling of complaints about clergy sexual misconduct. So essentially, what it comes down to is, again, it's the vice president who's responsible for dealing with the lawyers, as it were, and, you know, Unitarian Universalist legal action and so on. Ironically, in 2010, so a couple of years before I was falsely accused of blasphemous libel, of violating Canada's blasphemy law, Kathleen K. Montgomery signed on to an amicus brief that was opposed to the blasphemy law of an American state. I believe Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly, Pennsylvania still had a blasphemy law in the books. Somebody had been accused of violating Pennsylvania's blasphemy law. And I don't know if they're actually prosecuted or not, but they certainly, I believe, were arrested and charged, at least. I don't know if it ever actually went to trial. And the whole purpose of an amicus brief is to try to, essentially say, well, this shouldn't go to trial kind of thing. So she signed on to this, she, representing the Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA Executive Vice President Kathleen K. Montgomery signed on to an amicus brief that essentially said that all blasphemy laws are unconstitutional. That's one of the key things that the amicus brief said, is that these blasphemy laws in the United States are, go against the Constitution of the United States. They go against the First Amendment, if I'm not mistaken, the one about free speech. I'm pretty sure that's the First Amendment. So that's it. So talk about a gigantic hypocrite, as an individual. And then, of course, the Unitarian Universalist Association as an institution. On the one hand, it is pretending or claiming, and I'd say rightly so, that blasphemy laws are unconstitutional in the United States. They go against the U.S. Constitution, and yet they try to have me charged with violating, or they threaten to have me charged with violating Canada's blasphemy law for blogging about their pedophiles and rapists. So gigantic hypocrisy on the part of not only Kathleen K. Montgomery as an individual, but of the Unitarian Universalist Association as an institution, and indeed Unitarian Universalism as a religion, because essentially what it comes down to is the Unitarian Universalist Association. Yes, it's an association.